Just a quick heads up that these are adults having adult conversations about things that take place on a show where the adults use a lot of adult language. All this to say, there might be some salty language ahead, so please plan accordingly.
You've made him a team player. You've got him to pass and shit. And in doing so, you've made him average. Because Jamie, deep down, at your core, you are a prick. So just be a prick. We need you to score more goals, and we need you to get in the other team's fucking heads and drive them up the fucking wall like only you can fucking do.
So I can go back to being a prick?
No. I'm saying sometimes, when it is appropriate.
What would Ted Lasso do? That's the question we explore in each episode of this podcast. We take the lessons we learned from Ted Lasso and apply them to the real world through the lens of leadership and positive psychology. My name is Dimple DeBalia.
And I'm Jeff Harry. We hope you enjoy this episode as much as we enjoyed making it, and that it helps you discover your own Lasso way and embrace what it means to believe. Yeah, did you do absolutely nothing? Because that is the best weekend ever.
What did I do this weekend? Yeah, I didn't do much. Oh, I actually got some stuff organized, which was like a really big deal because,
Nice.
yeah, it's been needing to happen. So I did that, and I honestly have no recollection of the weekend. So clearly nothing important happened. So how about you?
I just hung out with some people. I saw a Warriors game. Oh, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. and drank at 6 a.m. at a bar. I don't think I've
Wow.
ever done that before.
What was that for?
The U.S. were playing at 7 a.m.
Oh, right.
I met a friend and I got to the bar by 6:10 and there was already a line.
Oh my gosh, that is insane.
I know, and I was at a bar that was not like that crazy. There were other bars that apparently were worse. So it was very interesting. I don't remember the last time I was drinking and then saw the sun come up.
So a few years ago, I went to Svalbard, Norway, and it was 24 hours of daylight.
Wow.
And that was really trippy to like walk out of a pub at 2 a.m. and it's like looked like the middle of the day. So, but yeah, I don't remember the last time I would have. I think it was back in college, like literally when I was
Right.
Yeah, when I was overseas. That's what it was. But oh my gosh, I'm curious. Like, do you think like the extreme interest in the FA Cup this year is related to Ted Lasso?
Oh, is there an extreme interest?
I don't know, or maybe I'm more attuned to it now because we're doing this. I just feel like a lot more people were watching this year and talking about it, and
I couldn't tell you. I mean, I don't know. All my friends are, well, not all my friends. A lot of my friends are soccer fans anyway, so they've been watching it for years. So
yeah.
I think there might be more interest by people in the US that don't watch soccer. But I think it's a combination of like Ted Lasso, that Wrexham show that
I was
just came
gonna
out.
ask.
I haven't
Yeah, I
watched
was gonna
that.
ask.
It looks interesting. I think I saw like half an episode. It looked interesting, but
It's
also like
really
an
good.
investment. And I was like, man, I don't have time for another show. I'm trying to
I
watch
really
Star
enjoyed
Wars right
it.
now. I'm trying to watch Andor. That's what I'm trying to do.
Oh, nice. Yeah, no, I watched Welcome to Wrexham. I really enjoyed it. I thought they did a great job, and it felt like almost like the real life version of Ted Lasso happening to an extent. I mean, they weren't coaching or anything like that, but
Yeah.
I thought it was really good. So yeah, maybe that's kind of adding to the excitement as well too.
I
So,
think there's
yeah, I don't know.
also, at the same time, there's a certain level of excitement. I'm assuming, and I don't have any verification of this, that also some European fans, or at least English fans, are quite annoyed by the U.S.
Why is that?
interest. There's a U.S. company that owns Manchester United,
Oh yeah,
and they're running them into the ground.
that sounds familiar.
So there's a
Oh
lot.
dear.
There's a lot of of that happening, where there's more and more US companies like putting their hands into stuff that they don't understand. And it's, yeah.
Well, should we jump into this episode?
Let's get into it.
All right. So today we are talking about season 2, episode 6, The Signal. It was written by Brett Goldstein and directed by Erica Dunton. This was like another one. It was like jam packed with so much stuff. Like last week we had a lot of things going on, or the last episode we had a lot of things going on as well. So, kind of some key storylines happening. So, first there was the whole Diamond Dogs like male friendship piece, which I thought was really interesting. And then there's the whole thing between Roy and Jamie and Roy and Nate. So with Roy and Jamie, it's kind of their relationship, but also, it made me think a lot about like a lot of the leaders you work with who move up within the organization and then have to go back to like coach or mentor or whatever the people that they've left behind who they didn't necessarily always get along with. And so I thought that that was actually a really fascinating storyline. And then the whole thing between like Roy and Nate and just finding that balance between that external success and feeling satisfied internally. And then, of course, Ted with his panic attacks, and then the whole storyline with Rebecca and her mother, which I thought was really interesting as well. So, where would you like to start?
I mean, let's start at the beginning with the 4-game win streak. Let's talk about it. 4-game win streak, which is huge. If you've had, I don't know, was it 10 ties, something like that? Some obscene amount of ties. And the fact that then not only are you having a 4-game win streak, but then you're competing against like Premier League top 5 talent. Like, and for anyone that doesn't know, like Tottenham is legitimately top 5 best, English Premier League teams, like, there is, right? You have Song from South Korea, you have Harry Kane who starts for the English team. So, I mean, you have legit play. I think even Foden might be there, Phil Foden. So, just being able to compete at that level is like a huge deal. So, on top of the 4-game win streak, the fact that they're competing in what was that, the quarterfinals against Tottenham is like a huge deal. It's probably could be one of their biggest games of like a decade if they are able to win or even tie the game.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, like I I went down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out if the player that Jamie is like taunting is wait, was that the Tottenham game?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. If that was a real player or if that was not. And so I put a question out in some of the Facebook groups. And so people came back saying it was not a real player.
Yeah, I don't know that player at all. I was like, who is the guy? Yeah. And I did not see Harry Kane out there, but still,
Yeah. Yeah. No, but I thought that was really cool. So yeah, I love that they're using like real teams and that. But yeah, so let's talk about this. So we hear about the Roy Kent effect up towards the beginning of the episode, right? So last episode, he agreed to become a coach, and now they're on this four-game winning streak, and people are attributing it to Roy. So what did you think of his coaching?
Well, I mean, first off, such a last great episode. I don't know if I explained how much I loved that episode when he finally walks at the end. I mean, we could go through the whole thing, but I won't. But, we already did. But he walks onto the pitch, I don't forget what Ted said, but he was just like, you had me at hello or whatever it is. Hello, coach. So I'd already just being moved by that moment, right? And then going into this one where now he's like screaming at the players and he's calling them out on their BS and they're listening to him. Like, this is the balance of the like masculine and feminine that I feel it was like needed, right? Like there needs to be a competitive edge that combined with the divine feminine that I feel Ted is bringing is really helpful. In addition to the doctor also showing up. So all 3 of them are playing a major role, not discounting Beard and Nate's contribution, but those 3 are playing a major role in how this group is actually evolving.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. So like the whole thing with Dr. Sharon, right? I was reading this article yesterday about, we only really have gotten to know her through these like very short interactions in like hallways and, like there's not really any major scenes with her in terms of us hearing what she's saying to the players or anything like that, right? Like but we know like when we see the end of her interaction with Colin in this episode where she says, I love your new mantra. And Colin is like, I am, what is it? Like, I am a
I'm a
strong and
strong and capable man.
yeah. And I love, and then he says, and I am not a piece of shit. And she says, well, you don't need that last part. And, and so it's just like, the idea of like helping these players work through a lot of these self-limiting beliefs so that they are getting out of their heads and they can show up as the best version of themselves. So yeah, I definitely attribute a lot of this to her.
I think it's also interesting what you just pointed out, that we don't see her sessions. Like we as the viewer don't even get to be in those sessions. So we're wondering the whole time, like, what is she saying? Like what magical words? And then the contrast between what she's saying to Colin at the time, and then Ted comes in and he's all folksy and he's high-fiving people and making jokes about, the gifts to the guy that laughs really, in a weird but funny way. And,
Yeah.
he's just being his relatable self, but you may not, realize, or I think people see this all the time where like, you know, someone that's depressed could be really happy, right? Or someone going through a lot of stuff could be really joyous and gregarious at times, and you don't know what he's actually going through, right? And you think about the fact that he like gets a phone call to bring like lunch to his son, and he's like, "I'm in London," and you just think, "Oh, okay, that's just a small thing," but you don't know how like that keeps eating away at him all the time, and how that could eventually manifest into something.
Yeah, definitely. And like we've seen in the past that his panic attacks often come on because, or he'll hear his son's voice. Remember, like the very first panic attack we saw in season 1, like the big one, we heard his son's voice coming into that, right? And so yeah, definitely a lot of, and we've talked about this before that we never know what other people are going through. And so that's part of this. But yeah, like I think it's kind of fun to watch Roy stepping into this role. Like I think he's a good coach and he has that technical knowledge. And so this is where I think we've kind of chatted about this before too, that Roy brings that technical skill and like the know-how of actually having been on like boots on the ground, right?
Right.
But then you've got Nate, who's actually like very strategic. He understands the strategy, he understands like the game. And so they each bring like really unique strengths to this coaching relationship. But with Nate, he's so caught up in kind of the insecurity and the jealousy of Roy coming on, which is a shame because what I loved about the win, and I know we're jumping all over on this particular match, but like what I loved about the win was when Rebecca praises Roy or congratulates Roy and says, it's the Roy Kent effect, and he says, no, this was all Nate. Like he doesn't even for a second take that on himself, and and is willing to just share that. And so you see where he's coming from versus where Nate's at when he's doing his like interview and so it's like two very different places.
Well, you also have to remember, like, Roy's been on the performance stage his whole life, right? Like, this is
Yeah.
not that big of a deal for him. Like, if he fails here, it doesn't matter. He's still Roy Kent, right? Everyone's always going to chant his name and he's always going to be famous. But for this guy, Nate Shelley, the Wonder Kid,
Yeah.
it's just like this is his time to shine. This is for him to prove to his father, that you can't do better, right? Like you can't do better than me. The way in which like he lost his first girlfriend because his father was like, I think you can do better than my son. Like that's where he's actually coming from. But it's just, going back to the beginning, like again, I haven't watched the whole thing, so I don't know what's going to happen. But
You mean the whole season? You did watch
I
this
haven't seen
episode.
the whole season, so I don't know what's going to happen next. But I've gotten, whenever you go on Twitter, like bad thing, Nate, whatever it is, right? So I know he's leaning towards something, but why is he just such a dick? Like he's just so mean still. Like he's still so like he's like I've seen this before with, a manager that gets promoted to another position and then feels they need to wield their iron fist to prove that they're strong, but it just comes off as so insecure with the suit and the attitude and the strategy. And I'll get later on into the whole park the bus strategy, but I thought that was a bad decision. That was a bad decision that they got lucky on. And if you think about it, like up until Roy joined the team, there was no one with soccer experience, right? Like Coach Beard
Yeah.
was calling the plays, right? Like yikes.
Yeah.
So to
Yeah.
think that not only is Roy bringing like actual on the field experience, he's just bringing like knowledge that frankly Nate does not have. Like Nate is just guessing, right? Based off of like what he's researched and what he's studied, but Nate has not been like in it. So he does not understand how to motivate. Team A.
Yeah. I mean, you're right about the motivation maybe, but like I don't think that I mean, I think there's plenty of coaches who haven't actually played the game, right? So like it's about like I think what Nate brings to the team is important. And it may I don't know, like it may have been a bad call or a lucky call on his part.
I think it
But
was
when he
lucky.
goes to like explain like his reasoning behind it, like that also makes sense. But I thought what was interesting was that he when he gets into that mode of what he considers confidence, and I put
Yeah.
confidence in air quotes, like just the fact that he shuts everyone else out, right? Because
Right.
like they're both asking him, like, well, what's going on? He's like, I've got this. And he just
Yeah.
walks away.
Yeah.
And so to your point, like I think you hit the nail on the head. Like I think he behaves that way because he's insecure and because
Yeah.
like, the whole thing from last episode about like becoming big, like figuring out how to make yourself feel big. And now he's found this persona, his spitting persona, right? Where he hates himself until he like can get into that space mentally. It's so he made his way into that. But again, going back to how this plays out in workplaces, like again, a lot of times when people move into these leadership roles and don't have the experience and overcompensate, which is what he's doing because they're insecure, they will often shut out the people around them, right? So I
Yeah.
just had a coaching client recently who was telling me about how he was really struggling because he said, there's this woman on my team who is just really good at what she does. And I feel like she doesn't recognize me for helping her. And, when she presents to people, she makes it seem like these are all her ideas. And he's the leader of the team. And so his inclination is to want to do everything himself and not like involve anybody and get the
Yeah.
credit. And that all comes from this place of like deep insecurity about being able to show up and the belief that like, oh, I deserve to be here and I deserve to be a leader in this organization because I'm bringing something of value, right? And so yeah, so I thought that that was actually really interesting to see how he handled that.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, just comparing Roy's knowledge of soccer in comparison to Nate. It's not even just that Roy was a star soccer player. It's just the amount of soccer coaches, at least in English Premier League and a lot of European, they used to play. A lot of them were former stars, actually. And the ones that weren't
Mhm.
former stars proved themselves through many different and also been on the pitch. Nate has never been on the pitch, or we don't know if he has since his high school days or whatever it is. So
Yeah.
even his strategies, I think, as an assistant coach, are different from him being like a head coach. And I don't think he would even be qualified, frankly. I don't know if my question isn't just, oh, Nate's insecurity and is like, and trying to mask that with dominance and a certain level of toxic masculinity. But I also don't think he's just that knowledgeable, frankly, in my opinion, especially from what
Yeah.
I've heard so far.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I guess I think I don't doubt you at all in terms of coaches in the English Premier League, but I think looking at the broader spectrum of coaches across different sports and stuff, I don't think that everyone has always been a player to coach, and I think that the show would have us believe that Nate actually does see something that a lot of the other coaches can't see. And that was part of the reason why, so like remember the roast that he did in the last season where he was just like really mean to each player.
Yeah,
And
but
so
that roast that I saw was the same roast that a lot of like fans potentially could say. Like again, is like, well, is he that knowledgeable of the players? Yes, I guess he's knowledgeable enough to like do that roast, but there's a difference between doing that and being like a head coach. And I
oh,
still think there's a
100%.
massive
Yeah.
gap.
100%. Like I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but that I think that he does bring some value to this and that he does have that ability to see or to bring in the strategy piece that I think oftentimes like you've got leaders who are like the big vision people and they see things a little bit differently versus the people who are in the field like doing the work. And those two things often will butt heads because the people who are on the ground are like, I know how to do this and I know how to do it better because I'm on the ground, right? Whereas the person who maybe is like the vision person or whatever is looking like further ahead. And I think, at least in my view, like that's kind of the difference between Nate and Roy is like, I think, I genuinely do think Nate sees things a little bit differently. And Roy is just bringing his raw talent and his own experiences to motivate and to connect on that level with the other players because he knows what it's like to be out there, which I think you're right. Like Nate doesn't connect with them on that level. Not to mention he's really mean, right? Like so
Right.
when they were passing in practice or in training, Nate yells at Colin, he says, "You dolt." Right? And
Yeah.
everyone kind of looks at him. And Roy like gives him actual instruction, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
Colin, you need to do this, this, and this. And again, I think to your point, it's because Roy has been there and has actually done that, whereas Nate necessarily hasn't, right? So I think,
Right. Maybe I'm still stuck on the questioning of the call, because just
yeah,
just for anyone that knows, like the whole point of parking the bus is you're just sitting back and just waiting. And it's one of the worst decisions a coach can ever make. And coaches do this all the time because they're scared of losing. They're playing what is it? They're playing to
playing out the
lose
clock.
rather than trying to win. And you can't actually counter when you park the bus. So the whole idea
Mhm.
that they actually even scored isn't really realistic in a soccer realm because you have everybody back.
I
You
feel,
bring all the forwards back. So it's like it's a Hail Mary that you
yeah.
actually score because then you run up as only two people versus like seven defenders. So that's why when I heard he scored, I was like, oh, that's pure luck. Like that is not a good strategy at all. And then he's taking credit for a really bad strategy, right? And you're like, oh, so maybe I was just stuck on that because you could even hear the announcers being like, you're at home, you have the momentum, they're scared. You should actually go and attack. So yeah, I thought it was a bad call. I just thought it was a really bad call.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, and it very likely was a bad call. But yeah. So he makes the call. I want to talk for a second just about the signal itself because I thought that that was actually pretty funny. And so going back to this relationship between Roy and Jamie. So their relationship is complicated, right? Like
hmm
first of all, they didn't get along when they played together. And then now on top of that, Roy is dating Keely, so there's like that element of it. And now there's a shift in the power dynamic too, right? So Roy was the captain before, but it didn't seem to really matter to Jamie. And now you've got Jamie, who we see like growing as a person and like actually wanting some direction. Yeah. And so that whole scene in the hallway, I'm curious what you thought about that, where like Keely tells him just agree with everything he says. So Jamie does that. And the things that Roy starts having him say, what came up for you?
Oh, when he has Jamie say you're an ugly, ugly boy with
Yeah.
bad hair, and he
Yeah.
doesn't want to say that he's an ugly boy. No, I thought it was interesting, right? In the sense of I think Roy says you don't deserve it because he doesn't think he wants to change. And then Jamie is just like, no, I do want to change. And he's like, all right, prove it. So we're going to play this little game right now where you're going to have to agree with me on everything. I think it's interesting because we have to remember what Jamie was like the last time he played with Roy. Like, he was horrible, extremely
Yeah.
horrible, and literally criticizing Roy at all times of how like slow and old and whatever it is he was. And now he wants help. Now, now in this. So yeah, I thought that was hilarious and interesting. But then the advice that Roy says is so fascinating because it was like not what I would have expected, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, now that you have him passing, he's lost that Jamie tart to tart to tart tart. Jamie, like he's lost that edge because part
Yeah.
of playing, as we remember when we got the captain to like learn how to play again out in the streets, right, is like you have to be yourself out there. And Jamie's kind of a prick, so like
Yeah.
how do we manifest the prick in a channeled and focused way, but not all the time, because frankly he still needs the pass and he still needs him to be a team player, but at times he's best when he's like really annoying.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like, I think that that's some of what motivates Jamie, right? Is being able to get in players' faces and to do the trash talk. And you see like that shift as soon as he like gets the actual signal, which I thought was hilarious with all of them flipping him off. But once he gets the actual signal and understands like, oh, okay, I can do this now, you see that shift and you see a little bit of that old Jamie start to come through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like where he sticks out his tongue and all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was pretty funny. But you know what I love about this though, and kind of along with the Nate storyline too, is that I like that they dragged it out a little bit, because if I was Roy, I wouldn't be
Yeah.
believing Jamie either, right? Like
Yep.
it's going to take time for that trust to build there too. And so I like that they're like taking their time and they're making him make Jamie work for it, right?
Yeah.
And so same thing with Nate in terms of him being a jerk and being in how he's dealing with people. Like, I don't think that's something that changes overnight, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
that takes time to figure out who you are and how you can show up and do this work in a way that's not going to be that way. And so, and sadly, a lot of people do not ever get there. So yeah, so I think I like that they're keeping with it because yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the Chicago Bulls back in like 98, 99, when they brought on Dennis Rodman. And people were like, there's no way you can work with Dennis Rodman. And Michael Jordan and Phil Jackson like figured out how to work with this guy,
Mhm.
and still allow him to be himself, but also figure out how he could fit with the team. And that's really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. The other, I just want to kind of close out this section kind of. So we get through the whole match. We've like that, the whole comedy in the locker room between Roy and Jamie and Ted saying, in this case, Jamie is actually right, and I thought that was great. But I just thought it was funny, that whole back and forth. And when he does say like, it's your fault. And then everybody's like, whoa. And so, yeah, I thought that was really well done and kind of fun.
It's also crazy what Jamie does because he does a Larry Bird thing. So Larry Bird would tell people where he was actually going to shoot to win a game before he actually won it. So like the
Oh,
audacity of Jamie to tell that guy what's going to
yeah.
happen. And then he gets in his head when he's just like, I told you.
Yeah.
And that this is even before he shoots the shot. You already
Yeah.
know this thing's now going to go away. It's just like, yeah, and everyone else is like, it's too far. And it's like, no, Jamie has already said it. So if he's already said it, now he has to prove it that he can do it,
Yeah.
and Roy gets
Yeah.
that because he probably did something similar like that too when he was out on the pitch. So
Probably. Absolutely. Yeah, and so, we close out that storyline with Nate now. He's gotten interviewed. He makes a point of saying he's not a wonder kid, but really, like, I think he believes that he is, right? Like, there's
yeah.
something
Oh
very
yeah.
right? And so him sitting in his office and now reading all the tweets, right, that are about him, and that external validation of like, okay, now people see me and they recognize me and they understand like who I am and what I bring to this situation, right? Which I thought was also interesting because that can be a double-edged sword because when that's like the only when all you're relying on is external validation,
Yep.
because clearly he doesn't have the internal, which is why he's
Nope.
so insecure. That's just like a recipe for disaster.
Yep.
So
Especially when Ted moves him out of the way to hug Jamie. It's just like,
it
woo
was to
wee.
hug Roy,
I
yeah.
mean, to hug Roy,
Yeah.
yeah. And to think about
Yeah.
his father and the waitress and getting the table and like
Yeah.
everything is a major win for him, right? He has to win in this way. And yeah, it's sad. I'm very
Yeah.
nervous as to where that's going to go. On top of the fact of you're just like, wait a minute, Nate, you have your own office. That's a huge office. What's going on with Higgins? Like, why is Higgins' office like literally a desk and he's lying on the ground? I'm like, how is this? How is this happening? That was the
Well,
other thing. I
because
was just like, what's
remember,
going on here?
Higgins gave up his office to Dr. Sharon, and it was only
Right.
supposed to be for because she was only going to be there for a couple of days. But now that she's staying for the season, she offered it back to him, I think, and he said it was fine. So now he's just like floating around, like trying to find places to work, which I think is really funny. But let's talk. I want to talk about that. This idea of male friendships. I thought that whole scene around, at the beginning where Beard is talking about Jane Payne is her name, by the way.
Jane Payne.
And everyone just being like, "Oh, okay, that's great, that's great." And
Yeah.
that was like I was really surprised at the fact that Higgins was the only one. First of all, I really appreciated that he called them all out. Like I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was great. And I love the way that Higgins did that, where he was just super calm and he was like, I'm really kind of surprised that none of you had my back when
Yeah.
I said that. And I thought
Yeah.
that was such a lovely way to do it and to actually like hold people accountable. And so I was curious, like from a male perspective, in terms of like how they all kind of went around saying, "Oh, you never say anything about stuff." So I'm just curious, like, and I know like you do a lot of work around toxic masculinity, so this is
Uh-huh.
probably not true for you personally, but I'm curious if this is something that you have come across or experienced.
Oh, absolutely. I find myself doing that sometimes with my male friends. Most of the time, dudes aren't like, "Hey, we let's talk about your relationship." Like we just don't, like
Yeah.
usually or at least this is just my own experience, right? When I've seen myself bonding with other men and watching men bond with other men, it's usually we're watching something or we're doing something but we
Mhm.
rarely are like analyzing and getting into like the discussions about relationships. I don't think I remember the last time I spoke to a majority of my male friends about their relationships. There's only a few, and those are men that are like more connected to their like divine feminine, right? And are just open to
Yeah.
talking like that on a regular basis. But a
Yeah.
lot of my male friends, dude, like if I was to call them out and being like, so you're still doing that really bad pattern of dating, like they'd be like, who are you, dude? Like they'd
Yeah.
start roasting me. Like it would be a roasting on roasting, right? Because a lot of times we're just joking around and not
Yeah.
getting into that specific stuff because we've just never had that type of a relationship with all my friends that identify as women. Like yeah, we could do that all day, and that's just always been a pattern that I've always seen. And you really
Yeah.
actually have to, in order to cultivate that, you have to start having those conversations with your male friends. But most of the time that actually doesn't happen. If they're going to have
Yeah.
that conversation, they usually have it with their friends that are women.
Oh. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I was just really curious about that. And like first of all, Ted's example was kind of funny given that he told his friend at his friend's wedding, like,
Right,
like
exactly.
maybe not a good idea.
Maybe not, but that would be the only time in which you would say anything nice or anything heartfelt anyway, right? You would wait till that moment. You wouldn't have that conversation.
Right,
You
but
would
you wouldn't tell your friend at his wedding that his person is like, what did he say? Like a pill or something like that?
Right. But think of it, if you never have heartfelt conversations with your friends, right? And then you're like, when would I have it? That would be the one time. Obviously, it's a horrible time, but it's just like,
Yeah.
well, this is when I'm supposed to have heartfelt conversations with my friend because I'm telling him how great he is. So while I'm being honest about how much I love him, I'm also going to be honest about how I don't actually agree with this wedding. So like it kind of makes sense in a really illogical sort of way.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is hard regardless of gender to tell someone that, like you see them going down a bad path, especially in relationships. And in this case, Beard, like Jane is so toxic for Beard. And yet, like, I think it is one of the hardest things, regardless
Yeah.
of who you are, to say something to someone when you see this happening, because that person is in such a place that I can easily see how it would make them view you differently rather
Mm-hmm.
than their relationship. And so, yeah, I think but I love that they're playing with this concept of
Yeah.
male friendships in this way. And I love that Higgins is like true to himself to be like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I think something has to be said. And even after, like, like you see that scene of him sitting on the floor. And so Beard is on the video call with Jane.
Yeah.
And then she says she's going to go meet her, like, her, male
Sexy
model,
model.
yeah,
Yeah.
underwear model friend. And then I was trying to figure out, and what it is like you hear this like whining noise, and it's actually Beard, because he's like got this emotion that he can't let
Mm-hmm.
out. So he's kind of like, and then you see Higgins on the floor in front of the window making his funny noise, right? So
Yep.
that was like this whole thing. And so Rebecca recognizes when they're at the match that she says, "Oh, your noise is back." So,
Yeah.
and she also says, "Don't say anything." And so all these people have told him, and yet we see at the end that he
Mm-hmm.
tells Beard, right? And Beard gives him a hug.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I am curious to see, like, I've seen the season, but I don't remember how this kind of plays out because it's been a while since I've seen the additional episodes. But yeah, I love that they're playing with that. So I just
I
wanted
love that
to,
Rebecca already knew. She already knew the
yeah,
problem. You
yeah,
know, who else knew? Someone else knew too.
Keely,
Keely
Keely,
also knew. They all knew, but they were just like,
yeah,
yeah, we're not going to say anything about it. And Higgins is literally having convulsions, not saying it. Like it's who
yeah,
he is, right? It's who he is that he has to express it. And I think
yeah,
that's the also other part for Beard because Beard's like, yes, go ahead and express it. And then we're never going to speak about this again. Right?
yep,
And then, and then Baird goes, and then he gets scared by Jane Payne, right? And then Jane Payne
hmm,
changes his hat, and you're like, oh no, another thing,
yeah,
another red flag. So,
yeah, yeah. This was the first time I really picked up on that hat change. And it's interesting because it's a Kansas City hat. And so
oh, for
I
an
was,
English
yeah,
hat. Oh,
yeah, and so I was thinking about that too, that,
oh,
like, it's just continuing to, like, change who he is, because,
mm-hmm.
I mean, girlfriends give gifts to their boyfriends all the time, right? Like, that's not a big deal, but I think it's the way in which she does it, and maybe just carrying this knowledge that we have about her with us makes it feel a little bit more like that, but yeah.
Because he looked like at the beginning of the episode, right? He looked tense, he looked tired, and he looked like, kind of anxiety ridden. And it was like, oh my gosh, 2 missed calls from Jane Payne. Gotta go.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. And so I do want to just say real quick while I remember that when she calls him, he's eating his sandwich for their like sandwich switching thing that they do, but
Which I
he's reading the
love, by the
book.
way.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. So the book that he's reading in that scene is Football Against the Enemy by Simon
Ah.
Cooper. And it's based on, so Simon Cooper traveled to 22 countries around the world to look at how football has shaped each country and what differences
Ooh.
lie beneath each nation's way of playing. So I thought that that was actually really interesting that he was
And they showed that book
that.
numerous times too. So I was like, ooh, what
Yeah.
is there's something relevant to this, but I couldn't read what it was.
Yeah. Let's talk about Rebecca and her mother.
Mm.
So this was another really interesting storyline. First of all, I love her mother. She is adorable, and she's played by Harriet Walter, who has been in many, many things. But I loved the casual drop-ins of Esther Perel and Brene Brown by
I
her mom.
know. It takes two people to create a pattern, but only one to change it. Oh, mercy.
Yeah, and so even when she yells out of the window onto the pitch and she says, "I am a work in progress." I was like, "That's awesome."
When
So,
she
yeah,
literally was
I love
having a
that.
whole conversation with the team, and they're like, "Okay," like I don't like your whole
Yeah,
paragraphs. I was like, "Oh goodness, oh
yeah,
mercy." What did Ted say? That I wrote it down here. Meeting a person's parents is like reading their instruction manual about why they are nuts, and you're like, "Oh, well, I see that. That's a good point."
yeah, and then you hear Beard go, "Let's go!" Right?
Yeah, I
Like,
know, right, right.
that was so funny, and the fact that we
Lemon,
learned that Beard's mom is, full-blown QAnon now.
right, right. And you're like, and her Rebecca's mom saying lemon lavender mojitos. Oh, I just love that.
That sounds delicious,
That
actually.
sounds amazing. I want to have a lemon lavender
I'd
mojito with her.
I'd probably try some of those. Maybe we'll have to make some for next time. So, yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because you've got Rebecca who's now, like, in talks with our banter guy, who we now know who it is.
I thought it was Ted.
I know you did. Everybody
Oh
thought it was
my
Ted, but
goodness. I was not ready.
so we find out it's Sam, which I love. And we're getting to see like that other side of Sam through that conversation. So you've got like the emotional relationship she's building with him, and then you've got the
Yeah.
purely physical one she's building with Luca. And this
Good old
so
hunky app.
hunky
The hunky
hun-
app. You gotta love it.
no, you know what the app was?
What?
It's called Two Messent. Like the number two Messent.
Wait, really?
That
I
was
thought
the
it said
name of the app.
hunky.
His name, like she labels him as Hunky Luca,
Oh,
but
okay. She labels him as Hunky Luca. Got it. But the name
yeah,
of the app is called what?
Tumescent,
Oh,
like the number two, yeah,
yeah.
but Tumescent. I just thought that was so funny. And then you've got banter on the other side, and so yeah, so it raises. Okay, so you've got her in this place of wanting to find a relationship, and she's struggling between, that deep, meaningful, emotional versus like the physical, and it raises a question of like, how can you have both, right?
Mm,
But on the flip side, you've also got now this whole situation with her mom, right? And she says,
mm-hmm.
"Oh, my mom leaves my dad every couple of years and
Mm-hmm.
then he gives her some, environmentally conscious gift and she goes back to him." And so there's this whole thing about her standing up for her mom all these years and telling her you deserve better, because she said that to her mom, right? After when she said when she was in college one
Yeah,
time,
one
and then
time.
her
Yep.
mom stopped talking to her.
For 9 months.
Yeah. And then you've got her having gone through a series like that terrible relationship with Rupert, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken her this long to get out of that space. And so it was, yeah, I just found that really interesting, kind of that reflection of where her parents were at and how that has impacted her views about relationships.
Well, I think it's that whole idea of like, how do I stop the cycle, right? The emotional trauma cycle. Am I going to recreate the mistakes of my parents, or am
Mhm.
I ready to do something different? And it's tough because, how many of us know someone that reads Esther Perel and Brene Brown and all of these like thought gurus and then never does any of it? Like, can quote everybody, can like, knows exactly what to say, but then they follow the same patterns, that are detrimental to them all the time. Like we see it all the time. I mean, heck, anytime you want to know if someone's going through a tough time, simply look at their social media feed and how many inspirational quotes they're posting. It's
It's so
usually the
true.
exact opposite, right? Or how happy
Yeah.
they are all the time. And you get drawn into this. I mean, this kind of actually reminds me of like, some people I know where like they're so drawn in, like Keely and Ted are so drawn in by their mom, but because her mom's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I left him, I was sitting on the toilet, I flushed the toilet, I pulled up my trousers and I walked away. And Keely's like, that's so brave. And Rebecca's like, no, it's
She's
not.
just sitting back
Like,
rolling her eyes, yeah.
she's told this story so many times that makes her look like the hero, but I know she's going to do the same thing, right? And now I've been inspired by what Higgins was doing with Beard, and I'm going to have this really important conversation with my mom. And again, maybe
Mhm.
not talk to her for 9 months, but I'm willing to take that risk after seeing what happened with Beard and Higgins. And then she never gets that chance. It's just like, that's so disappointing, right? And you're
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
okay, she's just going to be back in my place a year from now. And to think how many years she's been doing this, right? Like,
Mhm,
and then to not have Rebecca be like, I'm going to do the exact same thing, because then she contacts Luca, like after she gets
mhm.
that letter, she doesn't reach out to Sam. She doesn't go to banter. She starts the pattern, the bad pattern as well, and gets naked Luca to come back out, who's like, ooh, so brave. You gotta love when he said that while he was naked. And she's like, get out of here. Like,
Yeah,
you're
right.
only here to be my toy.
Did you see the final message, though, from Sam? Like, she doesn't know it's Sam, right? So,
Yeah, let's meet up.
yeah,
Yeah.
that should be fun. Yeah, so this whole thing around the relationship, I found to be an interesting kind of mirroring of her own life, and
Mm.
I like what you said, though, about breaking that cycle and not, repeating it, and the kind of awareness that has to come in order for that to happen, you know?
But it's so much harder said than done, right?
Easier said than done.
Yeah,
It's easy
easier
to
said
say
than
it.
done. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy. Yeah, because I mean, you know, I'm sure I'm doing patterns that I don't even realize, are my
Mhm.
parents all the time, right? I think we all are.
Yep,
And it's
yep.
like, how aware can we be to like cut those patterns off while also not cutting them off? And I think that
Mhm.
is the biggest challenge that I find, you know, when you're trying to break from your parents.
Oh, yeah, for sure, right? Because, like, in order to do that, you start setting boundaries too.
Mhm.
To make changes requires setting boundaries, and as soon as you start setting boundaries and doing things differently than everybody knows you to have done them or expects you to do them, that's where it gets really hard. And I think that's where a lot of us, like, in those moments, it's easier to just be like, all right, fine, forget it, you know?
Yep.
And so you're right. It's much easier said than done. So what do you think of this Sam thing? I'm curious.
I don't know how I feel about that yet. Like, I need to see them together. I'm still stuck on the fact that I thought it was going to be Ted. So like that's so interesting now that I'm like, okay, well, I guess it's Sam, but like, oh, well, that's going to cause a certain wrench, and how's that going to work out? And yeah, I don't know. I have no idea how to feel about it yet.
I mean, I feel like they definitely directed us into believing that it could be Ted because
Oh
every
yeah,
time they'd show her, they'd show him and whatnot. But like, don't you think his messages would be a lot more like folksy and
I don't
whatever
know.
than
Oh, maybe. I mean, maybe you're right, but I don't, yeah, because I mean, Ted has phrases, right? That
yeah,
she probably
yeah,
could have picked up on and would have recognized or read. But yeah, I don't
yeah.
know. How do you feel about it?
Yeah. I love it. Like, I just think it's, like, empowering. Like, she's this older woman. I mean, there's a lot out there about, like, the power differential given that she owns the team and things like that,
Hmm.
which I think is definitely worth exploring, like, probably in the next episode. But I don't know. I love the thought of this, though. This idea that, like, there's this, like, really, amazing younger guy who's sensitive and funny and on all these things, and he, sees something. Well, he doesn't know it's her either, I guess, so,
Right.
but yeah, I love the idea of it. I think it's, an interesting way to go, so
I think, and this is going off topic to another topic that I found was so fascinating to me was the cheering at the Bake Off. Do you remember
Yes.
where they're cheering "Poor little cake, soggy bottom, poor little cake,
Poor
soggy
little
bottom,
cake, soggy
soggy
bottom.
bottom,"
Yeah.
and it makes you think like, oh, they do this for everything, right? And to think that it's not just soccer, but soccer just happens to be their soap opera. But if they didn't have
Yeah.
soccer, they'd find something else to celebrate in that chanting sort of way. And I think a lot of times people don't realize, like, when someone's like, "Why are you so into sports?" And it's just like, well, it's my soap opera, right? It's my voice, or America's Got Talent, or whatever show,
Yeah.
or Downton Abbey. That's my thing, but it happens to just be, a sporting event. And especially because we're doing this during the World Cup. I used to could not go to Qatar. So wrong. Couldn't do it. Just so many shady things happening. But having said that, going to the World Cup, and I went to like 3 of them: Japan, South Africa, and Brazil. When you watch people there, they really are like living soccer. Like
Mhm.
that's their life. And I met a couple people from Peru. Their team wasn't even there, but they were going because they wanted to make sure every Peruvian, people knew Peru was there. And he's like, I sold my house so that I could
Oh my
go to
gosh.
this. And I was like, what are you going to go back to? Like, he's like, I'll figure it out. And it was like, oh my goodness. So the level of joy that people get out of the
Yeah.
game is fascinating, and how they see it.
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
their play. It really is.
Yeah. It did make me wonder, like, if Rebecca and Ted and they were all there for lunch, like, do these guys do these guys work? Like, they're constantly in the pub, which was funny. Do you watch the Great British Bake Off?
I've seen it, but I don't
Okay.
watch it regularly.
Okay. Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And Soggy Bottom was one of Mary Berry's like catchphrases in the earlier seasons. And then I was trying to remember like who, because I couldn't remember if she used to say it or Paul Hollywood said. And so I was looking that up the other day, and then I found this article about like all the phrases that came out of that show that have like all this innuendo, and it was actually really funny. So maybe we'll link to
Well,
that.
what I have seen of that show is that everyone is really nice to one another, unlike a lot of American
Yeah.
cooking shows where they're like literally trying to sabotage each other's dishes. And it was just like, this is just so wholesome. I just love that it's so wholesome. And at the end, they bring all the families together to eat. I'm like, oh, this is so
Yeah,
lovely.
yeah. I love that show. But there's a new one called The Big Brunch, hosted by Dan Levy from Schitt's
Oh,
Creek. Yeah, and it's, like, super positive, like, everyone's super happy, and that was, like, one of the things that they had decided from the beginning is that they would really be nice to everyone. So, I really like that. Okay, so the last thing that we haven't really touched on is Ted's panic attack, and so it was interesting, so it's again, good to see that continuity that, just because the team is doing well doesn't mean that he's doing well. In fact, it seems to be putting more pressure on him, right? Combined with his son again, I think. Like, I think that that was like a big part of it. And it was interesting. I think, like, as he is moving into that space where he hears like the high pitched noises and stuff, we hear like the voices of people talking about Jamie Tart and I can't remember now if his son's voice was one of those.
yeah,
I feel
it
like it might
was.
have been, right? Like where he
Yeah,
was singing that Jamie Tart song.
yeah.
So, yeah, so that was interesting, right? So we see Jamie, like, they give him the signal, he does his thing, they're now winning, it's all good, and all of a sudden, he starts going into panic attack mode. And I love that, again, Beard recognizes something's going on
Hmm.
because he asks him, like, "Hey, coach, are you okay?" But yeah, so again, what came up for you?
Well, I love that they first showed his fingers, right? And
Mhm.
then the shaking, and then him having to put that away, and then he's just like going through, and it's just like when they were at karaoke, right? Like everything's slowing down, and he's starting to freak out. But then also, I think it was really interesting that then he walks off, and then there's all these stories about where did he go and why did he go there, and there and people are going to probably start talking about like, well, they won because Nate was there, and they now have Nate and Roy, and maybe they don't need Ted anymore in his folksy thing. What they need is more Roy and Nate. But I think the part that I found even more interesting was they didn't show the score. They didn't show the
Mm,
celebration. They didn't show the win because it wasn't a win. Even though they were winning, she's like looking around and she can't find him anywhere. And that is really concerning because you're like, you see his jacket on the floor and you're like, did he quit? Like,
mm,
did he fly home? Like, you have no idea where he is. And
mhm,
that person lives and breathes that stadium. So like, where would he go? Like go back to his house? So I found that just really powerful. And then to find him of all places, because you think at the beginning of the episode he's high-fiving and he's doing all these things, and and then Doc is just like, whenever you want to make an appointment, and he's like, we talk all the time. You hear me talking all the time. I'm always talking. You should just hang out with me for 15 minutes and you don't need to talk to me after that because you'll know I'm talking so much. And at the end, he is silent. He is
mhm.
dead silent in that room in a fetal position. And he only says like
Yeah,
one sentence, I need to make
yeah,
an appointment.
okay,
Like,
yeah,
damn. Like that
yeah,
level of contrast, that was really powerful for me. How about you?
yeah. Yeah, and I think, like, we talked about this last time, right? That, like, she sees past his, like, cheery exterior. So to your point
Mm-hmm.
about, people often will paste on that smile even though they are, like, really hurting on the inside. And so she sees past all of that, and she keeps putting the invitation out. And I really like that because there's an element of agency there, right? Like, we hear this often that you can't force someone to do something or you can't force someone to get help
Yeah.
until they're ready to get help. And so she keeps putting that invitation out there for him and he finally recognizes it. But to go back to Rebecca looking for him, what came up for me was, going back to your whole thing around attunement, like I think she's so attuned to him now
Mm-hmm.
to that she realized that it's not like him to walk off the pitch like that. And so something has to be wrong. And when she found his jacket, you hear her say, "Oh, Ted," like she
Yeah.
knows what's happening.
Yeah.
And then she's like surprised when all the team like rushes in because she's so like concerned about him and thinking about him, right? And then the fact that she calls him after that too to be
Yeah.
like, "Hey," and it's also I really liked it because it shows how far we've come since last season too, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
there's this genuine like love and friendship and admiration and whatever for each other and this desire to kind of take care of the other person, which, we didn't see from Rebecca for a really long time. And so yeah. But yeah, like I'm glad like they're continuing on. There was a really interesting article. It's actually from 2018. It was written by Aisha Harris and we'll link to it. But it was this article about the black lady therapist trope. And so in her
Mm.
article she talked a lot about how for many years in a lot of TV shows and movies and stuff, the black women were cast as like the best friend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that she was noticing that more and more black women were getting cast into these roles as therapists now. And so it was interesting though, because there's like, it's a little bit different because, like we said, like this time we're starting to see, like, we don't know Dr. Sharon very well yet. We just
Mm-hmm.
know those little bits of her that we're seeing, but there's enough there that you can see that she cares and that she is good at what she's doing, right? And so, anyway, it was a really interesting article,
Well,
even
it's
though
interesting you bring that up because I think of I mean, they refer to this in a very derogatory sort of way, but especially movies in like I mean, even probably earlier than this, but like at least the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was always the magical black wise person. Some people would call it like the magical Negro. Like that's how they would be, like there was something called the Legend of Bagger Vance, and it would be,
Mhm,
what is it? Matt Damon's a golfer, and then of course his caddy is Will Smith, right? This magical man who just shows up. Same thing with Driving Miss Daisy with Morgan Freeman, and you could even have
mhm.
that with The Help. It still went on with like The Help and all these other ones of like this
Yeah.
wise black person that is in the periphery, and they really never get the most credit, but they are they are providing the wisdom that the main character needs, right? So
Yeah.
I think this feels different for some reason, because it's not like she has all these like great sayings that then you quote. Like, she's not quotable. I don't know anything that she's said that is like quotable so far, probably because we haven't seen what she does in therapy. So I feel like there's a different groundedness to her, but there's a quiet. This is why it was, I think, a really powerful moment when they win. And then she goes, for the quarterfinal win, you get me for one drink. Like, that's a huge thing, right? That she's like, I'm willing to expand my boundaries for this one time, right? And then was about to go before she opens the door and finds him in there. Like, so it's like, wow, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's powerful.
Whew. A lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. A lot. So what are you taking away from this?
Oh, gosh. I was just about to ask you. I think, I think for me, it's going back to trying to be compassionate and understand when you come across toxic leaders like Nate, that there's a lot of insecurity there. And so just trying to keep that in mind. I don't know, for the week ahead, I'm not really sure. Like, I feel like a lot of this was like bigger arc stuff to me.
Oh yeah. I'm not just asking just for like the week, but I agree with you. Hurt people, man. See it all the time.
Sure,
it's so painful to see.
Yeah. But the other big thing for me goes back to the breaking of patterns. So the big excitement for me this week was that last week I finished writing my book. So
yeah.
Yeah. And that's a big part of what I talk about in there is like the patterns that we continue to repeat until we are able to bring the awareness to start breaking. So so that's another big one.
And that's so hard. So hard to do. For me, I don't know why I'm stuck on this soggy bottom, the singing of the Bake Off and the soggy bottom, but I love, for some reason, I love that. I love that those three guys play whatever they're watching. They're always finding some way to play. I mean, they may not be working because they're drinking all the time, but at least they're out there. So I loved that. But I think the other part that I think was just awesome is I'm loving how Roy is coaching. You know, I love that there is a certain level of like strong masculinity that he's bringing to the team, but that also, you know, he was even willing to bring back the prick. Like, he's willing to garner, even though, you know, he knows that might also upend the team. He's willing to take that risk. And that's like bold, you know, and that's showing a certain level of growth, because in the past, all he wanted to do was just like shut Jamie down. And now he's willing to take a step back. And I think the thing that's going to be really interesting is, how is Ted going to be different now that he's getting therapy? You know, how is Nate going to be different now that he's now that he's getting praise, right? And not getting therapy, right? And how does Roy and Beard play into this? Because like, Beard's clearly not going to be able to support Ted as much because he's got Jane Payne to deal with. So it's just like, there's so many layers. And you know who's keeping it all together? Higgins.
Higgy Bottoms.
Higgy Bottom.
All right. Well, this was lovely as always, and I appreciate you and the discussion. So
thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back and listening, and I'm excited for the next episode. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of What Would Ted Lasso Do? If you got any nuggets of Ted Lasso wisdom from this episode, try them out in your life and let us know what happens at WWTLD Podcast on Instagram or on our website, wwtldpodcast.com, where you'll also find a full transcript of the show. We love hearing what other Ted heads took away from the episode, or details or perspectives that we might have missed.
And if you do like the show, please subscribe and head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star rating. Every rating helps us get our show in front of more listeners. To that end, We'd also ask if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends, loved ones, randos on the street. You get it.
Thank you to the team at Podify for producing our show, to Kajal Dabalia for all our visuals and graphics, and to Kenzie Slato for our theme song. And most of all, thank you to all of you for listening.
Ted Lasso could simply just be another show to binge watch, or if we challenge ourselves to consistently ask the question, what would Ted Lasso do? It could change the trajectory of your life. It has for us.
So join us again next time as we explore another episode and ask ourselves, what would Ted Lasso do?